And it hits me, oh my gosh, this is that triangle.
You know, there's explanation for everything that occurred in the Rendlesham Forest incident that doesn't involve aliens at all.
It was completely silent. It comes right over our heads.
He saw a classic flying saucer really standing in the clearing.
He turned over to my father and held his hand, and he looked in his eyes and he said, "We're not alone."
Welcome to Podcast UFO for our live show. We're live every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on podcastufo.com. During the show, feel free to participate live in our chat room. And don't forget to like us on our very active Facebook page.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host. Our guest this evening is Paul Kimball. Paul is the president of Kimball Media in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is an umbrella company over Kimball Media Radio, Red Star Films, Red Star Books, and he has produced and written, directed programming for television around the world, including the documentaries Stanton T. Friedman is Real, just like Flying Saucers Are Real, that Stanton always says. I love that title. He also did Best Evidence, Top 10 UFO Sightings. That's a great movie. That's on Netflix now. And a lot more. His blog is called The Other Side of Truth and has a great slogan I really like on it, and that's "Don't believe, don't disbelieve, think." I like that. Anyway, but before our guest, I have Alejandro Rojas with the latest UFO news coming up. And I have to mention this for a while. Pardon me if you heard it a million times. But again, a lot of people don't listen to every show. Some people listen to every 1 out of 3 or something. If you haven't been able to tune in, we are now running our shows live on podcastufo.com on the sidebar. Our show is still on the Dark Matter Digital Network, only now it will be this show recorded and be playing on Thursdays at 9 to 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time or 6 to 8 Pacific Time. And the network, Dark Matter Digital Network, is carrying on, and Heather Wade is in the driver's seat of Art Bell and doing a great job. That's it, and we're still having issues with phone calls to the show, but if you want to Skype in, that Skype username is Podcast UFO. That's all. Just Skype in if you'd like to talk to the guest. And you can also jump in the chat room at podcastufo.com and pose our guests some questions this evening. And don't forget, our show is 100% free if you listen live. And it's also free if you listen on the Dark Matter Digital Network. Or you can support the show for only $2 a month. I'll be talking about that in the first hour, ending of the first hour, I should say. So that's it. Let's bring in Alejandro. How are you, Alejandro?
Good. How are you doing?
Good, good. Busy, aren't you?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Very, very busy.
Well, thanks for taking a break. And I'm really looking forward to come out there.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. And it's fun to talk to you now because I haven't had a show for a couple of weeks now. I've been so busy with the conference. To let listeners know if we have some crossover, I should be having a show Monday. I've got one planned, so but that'll be the last one before the conference. And we have a UFO report. We didn't have one last week, but we'll have one of those up about some of the news that we've talked about recently. So, yeah, it's getting really exciting. We're getting lots of media attention. I just talked to a guy from MSN a little while ago, and they're going to be running a story here soon.
Great.
So soon, well, actually, some stories have already popped up. Some people might have seen Fox 10 News locally did a story on a local UFO crash legend. And then and I was interviewed in that, and then they also talked about the UFO Congress. And so pretty soon here, all the media will start popping up, which is always a lot of fun.
Yeah. Speaking of the UFO Congress, if you are listening to this show and you are planning on going there, I would love to meet up with you. So how will you find me or I'll find you? That is, I'll have to work that out. But if you want to email me, go ahead and email me. We'll stay in touch, and I'd love to meet any of the listeners. I've met a whole bunch of them last year, and my email address is martin@podcastufo.com. Please email me if you're going to be there, and we'll catch up. It'll be a lot of fun. So what's going on for the news this week?
Well, I was going to say, to find you, they can also look at the cameras, because you're going to be helping with some cameras at the conference. So when they're at a talk, don't go, hey, Martin, during the talk when you find him. But afterwards, you can go up and you'll at least the shift where they're doing some camera work. So that'll be helpful. That's going to be fun.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I forgot about that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So news for the week, of course, we've already talked about the CIA files, but man, they have been all over the place.
I know. And I heard Lee Spiegel talking about this, and I talked to him the other night, but it's like nobody is doing any research into the fact that these files were already out. They're just, it's just, they're all riding the wave is what it is. Yeah.
What I focused on, I finally wrote my story, and I focused on, first, these files were already out. Secondly, the CIA is all, look at our UFO files. Well, they didn't let those files out easily.
Right.
They had to be pried from them via lawsuits. At first, they denied having any files at all until they were sued and finally had to release them. So it's not like they happily gave them up, although I do like their articles. And Lee made a really good point, too. In one of the articles, they talked about the Lonnie Zamora case where this police officer saw this craft flying around. But maybe Lee talked about this on your show. They left out that there were two little guys.
That's right.
The police officer.
Yeah, that's left out of Project Blue Book, too.
Yeah, well, it is in some files, but it's not in some files. So it's kind of weird. But there's a researcher, and I can't remember his name right now, who's done a lot of good work around that. Maybe it was Ray Stanford.
Yeah, Ray is pictured in that as well.
Yeah, I think Ray's the guy to talk to about that.
That's right. Yeah.
So there have been some other sightings around. Of course, we post the daily headlines on a regular basis. CIA's really taking over the stories out there. But there are some other interesting stories that are hitting the news that people can check out. You could just look at under articles, you can look at daily UFO headlines, or just on the front page, you'll see headlines there. But we've got a couple of interesting sightings submitted by Roger Marsh. Well, posted by Roger Marsh. These are actually sightings submitted to MUFON. One of them has created a little bit of controversy, and this is a triangular craft seen over New Jersey. And you see these three lights, and they're in a triangle. At first, they're a little out of focus, and they look sort of red. Once the person gets in focus, and they look like white objects. This was over Hazlet, New Jersey on Christmas Eve in 2013. The MUFON researcher said that, he felt that probably it was what the person said. In the video, you can just see these lights, and they do kind of fade out, and then allegedly they shut off quickly. And I said I think they look like Chinese lanterns. A couple people have gotten a little frustrated with me. Many have agreed, but some people are like, how do you know you weren't there? But really, the way they fade out, and we've talked about this before, when you have 3 points of light, they're going to look like they're making a triangle, even though they might not be. And the way the lights fade out really is reminiscent of Chinese lanterns. So I feel that that's what it at least, and like Mark D'Antonio says, given the video alone, you couldn't say it wasn't, I don't think. But, of course, along with the witness testimony, perhaps there's something else going on. But, you can go look at the video and agree or disagree with me. As others have.
Chinese lanterns can look fantastical. They really can.
They do. That's what's so fun about them. They look incredible. They're so much fun.
Yeah, they're fun until you're trying to do what you're doing and try to figure out whether it's really an unidentified object or Chinese lanterns. That part's frustrating. But to see them in person, it's like, wow, they're really quite amazing, actually.
Yeah, they really are. They can move quickly. They don't last very long, typically, but they are a sight to see. I mean, I think just the light from a flame in the sky is just kind of a different type of light, and it's very stark. kind of light. It's a neat light. So yeah, they are really neat looking. So it's easy to make the mistake. And a lot of people feel, people are overplaying the Chinese lantern thing. It's just that often lanterns are mistaken for something else.
Right.
And it just really is very common. And even as a researcher, you can't just say, well, I don't think that was. You've got to be able to prove that. You've got to be able to demonstrate why you're ruling that out. And if you can't rule it out, then unfortunately, let's move on and look at the next case, and hopefully it'll be better.
Right. So do we have another sighting or report?
Yeah, this is an interesting report. This one is over Atlanta, Georgia in 2013. This was 3 a.m. on November 16th. And the reason it's interesting is because this witness says they were engulfed in light from a hovering UFO. So they got out of their car, out of the driver's seat, and he says he leaned on my car towards the passenger side door near the trunk. I looked down at my phone and decided on what song to listen to, and they were about to push the button when this God light shone on me, is what they called it. So they said they were all completely whitened by this light. He says, as I lifted my head from frozen shock and sheer fear, I tried to look directly at the light, and instantly the light was gone, and in its place was a shimmering white light that then shot off to the northeast in the manner that would emulate if one were to light a sparkler and shake it from side to side.
Wow, they weren't listening to like gospel music or something, really.
No, I mean, yeah, this guy's got an interesting way of writing. They said they couldn't tell where the object was headed. They said it just vanished with a trail of orange-white light following behind it. And the witness says, I'm finally coming forward with all of my sightings, events, and encounters after speaking with and being advised by MUFON. So this person just recently, January 19th, submitted their report. So it's under investigation there in Georgia. But, yeah, how would you like that? You're standing outside your car and a God light is beamed on you. This is kind of interesting. Here's some news that I'm hoping to get to.
Okay.
I'm trying to write this story this week if I have time, but it's about Japan.
Yeah.
They are France's UFO organization. They just released their latest report, and it looks like they have about 13% unknowns. However, they break those unknowns. They have A, B, C, D category. Unknowns are the D category. They break those down into 4 more categories of types of unknowns. But out of that A, B, C, and D, many of those are also where you just don't have enough data, where you got to mark it as that and insufficient data.
Right. All right, so we got a couple of weeks before I'll be seeing you out there in Phoenix.
Yeah, no kidding. It's a week and a half till we're going to be hustling and bustling and putting everything up and in the middle of the chaos, but it's going to be so fun. So, yeah, like you said, come say hi, everybody. And if you can't find Martin, I'll try to tell you where he is. And looking forward to seeing everybody.
Absolutely. All right, Alejandro, we'll be talking to you next week, and maybe even if you do the show Monday, I'll be talking to you then.
Yeah, awesome. Talk to you soon.
All right. So hang on, everyone. We'll be right back after this quick music break with Paul Kimball. music is by a listener of the show who lives in Canada, and I thought that'd be fitting to put that since we have our guest from Halifax. And Paul Kimball, welcome to the show.
Hi, Martin. I think I've managed to figure out how to get the mute button working so that you can hopefully hear me as I speak right now. Good to be on the show. Thanks for inviting me on.
I can't hear you. Are you there? Just kidding. Paul, why don't you, I was contacted after I posted you by a few people that know you. Why don't you, I know you're involved in filming. You've done a lot of different things. You were a lawyer, and I forget what else, but you have quite a background. Can you tell the listener unfamiliar with you basically your background and how you got an interest in UFOs?
Sure. The background, sort of jack of all trades and master of none, I guess, is one way of putting it, or Renaissance man is another way of putting it, depending on how you want to look at it. I prefer the latter.
Yeah.
I have honors degrees in history and political science. I have a law degree, and I have 9/10 of a master's degree in history. I never quite finished my thesis.
Wow.
So I spent a good 10 years in university, briefly practiced as a lawyer, and by briefly I mean about 8 days, and then decided that probably wasn't what I wanted to do, so I went into the music industry as a musician.
Wait a minute, was that a divorce case or something?
No, it wasn't. It was
Wow.
My dad was a judge, so when I was growing up, I sort of my parents never pressured me at all to go into the law, but it just seemed like something that was natural for me to do. And by the time I got through law school and articling and called to the bar, I sort of realized maybe I'll do it someday. But right now I'm in my 20s and I want to go play rock and roll. So that's what I did. And because the music scene, Halifax was known as the Seattle of the East Coast back then. American record labels were up here signing everybody. And so I kind of thought, well, okay, sure, let's give this a try. And actually turned down a record contract from EMI. So
really?
that's my musical claim to fame. My former bandmates, if they're listening, and I doubt that they are, but if they were, they would be, don't remind us that idiot turned down our only recording offer. I thought there'd be a better one. And as it turned out, there was never a better one. There was never another one. So you sort of learn a lesson that way. The music thing petered out when my last band broke up in the late 90s, and I moved into the film industry, first working for the civil service here, the film agency, what used to be the film agency in this province that funded film and television until our austerity-driven government destroyed it last year. And then a year after that, I moved into the private sector as a writer, producer, director, figuring if all the people I was giving money to could make films, how hard could it be? Turns out it was a little harder than I thought it would be, but eventually, trial and error, I sort of got good at it. So I made, I think I heard in your introduction, I did make films. I have made films about the UFO subject. At one point, I was even introduced at a Christmas party by the head of the film agency to a sitting cabinet minister in Canada. So I have actually briefed a Canadian cabinet minister, not named Paul Hellyer, a real current Canadian cabinet minister on UFOs. And by briefed, I mean the sort of Stephen Greer method of briefing, which is meet somebody at a cocktail party and talk to them about UFOs for 10 minutes and then claim you've briefed them. And to be fair, he wasn't the minister of anything that would have anything to do with UFOs. He was the minister of fisheries. But, underwater UFOs, Shag Harbor, there might have been something there. But yeah, I was introduced as the UFO filmmaker, and I knew the cabinet minister. And so we had an amiable chat for about 10 or 15 minutes about UFOs until his assistant started tugging at his sleeve and said, you really need to get away from this guy. So, but I did a television series about classical music here in Canada. I did documentaries about pro wrestling and soul music, jazz music. I did a lot of music stuff, actually. And I did a television series about ghosts. It was called Ghost Cases. I was one of the co-hosts, and I was the director and writer and one of the producers. So, a very eclectic kind of, a working television guy who also happened to do a number of documentaries about the UFO phenomenon because I had an interest in it. Now I've moved into feature films. I haven't done a documentary since Best Evidence, Top 10 UFO Sightings back in 2008. So the UFO people liked it, but apparently nobody else did. So nobody's ever offered me any more documentary work.
Wow.
Although to be fair, I was moving into feature films anyway, so I've done 3 feature films since just finishing up one now.
Really?
How did I get into UFOs? What is it? Ask him who his uncle is. You know, my
Wait a minute. I have something right here. Alejandro recorded this. This Scott Sikora, you know him from Facebook. He was listening to my show on episode 2. We're now at episode 188. So somehow he found my podcast right away in episode 2. He's been a real avid fan all the way from the very beginning. And he said, when you talk to Paul Kimball, ask him this question right here.
Who's your daddy and what does he do?
That was Alejandro. I thought that was a pretty good imitation.
He's a little off because my daddy is a retired criminal court judge, and what he did was put bad people in jail. So I don't think that's who he meant.
He meant your uncle.
Yeah, he meant my uncle.
Yeah.
Stan Friedman is my uncle. He married my dad's sister, actually, so we're not related by blood, but he's been my uncle for about 40 years now, I guess. So I grew up as a kid. You know, I go to the family reunions once a year, and Stan's family would come down and visit. You know, we got to know him. But I love all my relatives. I really do. So if any of them are listening, I want none of them to take offense. But when you would get to this family reunion, I have some evangelical relatives, and that's not really my thing. And, you know, I talk baseball with some other people and stuff. But there was this guy, you know, if you're a 14 or 15-year-old kid, who talked about UFOs and space aliens. And when I was that age, it was, you know, Star Wars and Battlestar Galactica and Buck Rogers with the really, really attractive Aaron Gray as Wilma Deering. That's what I was watching as a kid. So naturally, I was, you know, greatly interested in talking to this guy. And, you know, Stan's a great guy. He's got a great sense of humor. I don't think a lot of people necessarily realize that. If you get to know him, not only does he have a great sense of humor, he has a very broad range of interests that have nothing to do with UFOs. So as I got older, you know, I would talk to him, frankly, more about things that didn't have to do with UFOs than things that did. So baseball, politics, religion, all sorts of stuff. And, you know, my dad had UFO books too. Everybody in the 70s had a copy of Chariots of the Gods and the Van Daniken book and a couple of others. So those were popular literature. And we grew up in that era where there was that gee whiz factor to space aliens coming to planet Earth through science fiction. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where my interest came from. And then when I went to college, I completely disappeared from about 1985 until 2001 when I did the film on Stan. I really had nothing to do with UFOs. I didn't pay attention to it. I didn't follow it. You know, I'd see Stan and I might ask him how he was doing, but then we'd talk about baseball or whatever. And when I was looking to do my first documentary as a director, I'd produced one or two others. You want to do something that you're familiar with. So I said, well, look, I like the idea. Errol Morris, I'm a big fan of him as a documentary maker. And he had just recently done a documentary, and I'm not comparing Stan to a Holocaust denier, but he had just done a documentary on a guy named Fred Leuchter, who is a Holocaust denier and a wingnut. But it's a wonderful documentary. It really gets into, you know, who this guy is and why he believes what he does and all that sort of stuff. And I thought, well, okay, a biography. I should do a biography. I don't know any Holocaust deniers, fortunately. So who do I know? Who's interesting? And a little off-center as far as the mainstream would be concerned. Hey, I know Stan Friedman. So as it turns out, we have a network in Canada called Space, which is the equivalent of Sci-Fi, more or less. And I pitched them the idea of doing a biography of Stan, and they said yes. And so being the good documentarian and historian that I am, as I was doing the Stan thing, I immersed myself into the UFO subculture again, and the subject, and it rekindled my interest. So for the next 7 or 8 years, you know, throughout the 2000s, if you will, I was sort of hot and heavy into UFO research and flame wars online and all the stuff that goes on with the subculture. And then, you know, over the last few years, I've sort of stepped back and turn my attention to other things, but I still keep an interest. I still have an interest in it. And every now and then I get dragged into things like the Roswell knot slides, or, you know, whatever you want to call them, where I sort of get involved in research efforts again, usually about the subculture, though, not so much anymore about cases or things like that. So there's the very long-winded You asked for it. There's a very long-winded background about who I am.
Yeah. Now, I imagine that that Stan would be anyone related to him would have to at least take a look at the UFO subject, when you're at a party hanging out with him or a family gathering or something like that. It's bound to come up because he's been in like a million different TV shows, for one thing. You see him when I wasn't even paying attention to the subject, I knew who he was, Anyway, I'm sure we talked briefly ahead of time. It's hard to agree with anybody all the time on this subject. And
yes.
you mentioned that you and Stan don't always agree.
We never agree. No, I shouldn't say we never agree. We agree on some things. We disagree on things like the things that are nearest and dearest to his heart, which are Roswell, Majestic 12, the entire crash flying saucer, space aliens meme, and a couple of other things. We generally disagree on all of those things. So, the things that we do disagree on, government secrecy, not necessarily completely related to the UFO subject. We definitely agree that the government does keep secrets. And, there are a few other things that we agree on. We agree that there are other interesting cases. Stan and I usually, when we do talk now, we generally don't talk about crash flying saucers or alien abductions because he knows where I stand on those two things. I know where he stands on those two things. And there's, neither one of us is going to convince the other one that they're right. So, you kind of say, well, what's the point of, discussing those things or arguing about them or whatever anymore? Let's talk about things that even if we don't agree on, we might be able to convince the other person that our position is right. We're open-minded. And so, we can talk about things like some of the cases that are in my best evidence film that you don't hear about very often because people are obsessed with Roswell or whatever. And other things like that, usually stuff that's on the margins of UFO, the UFO subculture, because, the subculture itself is so immersed in dealing with the idea of space aliens, crash flying saucers, and alien abductions. I mean, those are the sort of big three, and variations of those things. So generally speaking, the things that interest me the most now are high strangeness cases. Generally, the things that interest me the most are the things that you can't explain, and which I actually think is everything, but which is where I disagree with Stan. But the high strangeness cases where you can sit back and go, well, okay, that's really weird. That might not be space aliens from outer space. It might be this, or it might be that, or it might be nothing. It might be explainable. But there's a whole range of possibilities here, and so that interests me. And the group of friends that I sort of made as I went through the UFO sort of phase, Nick Redfern, Greg Bishop, the late Mac Tonys. I think somebody called us the Paranormal Rat Pack once. And I guess it kind of stuck. And guys like Aaron Gullius, who's an author historian in Michigan, who has written some books on the culture of the UFO, the people who study and get involved in UFOs. So that kind of stuff interests me more than tales of crash flying saucers and people who stand up and down and say space aliens. It must be space aliens, where there's 18 different species of space aliens on planet Earth, and I know that because I'm married to one. Okay, good for you, but that's not. I'd like to meet your wife, and maybe we can run some DNA tests on her.
Yeah, just like I think there was a recent X-Files where they're running that was episode 2 in the season 10, where they're running DNA because the girl says she's a hybrid or something. Interesting. And we'll talk later on about things such as your thoughts on abductions, because I always like to ask someone about that. But for right now, I wanted to tell that if anyone has anything they want to talk to our guests with, and you can Skype in, please just Skype in at podcastufo.com. Again, the phone, we're working on that. We're going to get probably a software system for that. And if you would like to jump in the chat room if you're listening live, that's right on the same website you're listening, podcastufo.com. Just 2 clicks to get in, and you can ask our guest some questions. I want to talk about some Canadian cases that I think are fascinating. One, I guess, is the Klondike Highway. incident, and I had Dawn on to talk. I think it's Dawn to talk about Shag Harbor. Those two are, to me, quite interesting cases that happened up in Canada. Would you like to comment on either one of those?
Yeah, I can talk about Shag Harbor. I'm less familiar with the 1996 Yukon case, even though it's actually in my film. So I'm familiar enough with it, but my understanding, and I would have to brush up on this, there was a relatively, I think, a pretty comprehensive deconstruction of that case done a couple of years ago, and I can't remember exactly who did it. It might have been Bob Schaefer, Tim Printy, somebody from the skeptical community, where they sort of explained what the Yukon case was, and I generally accept that explanation, even though I can't off the top of my head exactly remember what it was. So,
wasn't it supposed to be like a mile-wide craft or something like that?
That was
a bunch of different people saw in different locations along the highway?
No, yeah, it depends on who you talk to, and the problem with a lot of this stuff is that, and one of the things I did briefly that I left out of my long-winded background was I was briefly a police officer with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which sounds a lot more impressive than maybe it was. But when I was in law school, every year they would send 7 or 8 students out to be basically summer cops. You'd ride around with the Mounties and sort of see how things were done. I was the one in my year. They sent me to a rural detachment in northern Cape Breton. Folks, you can look it up. It's a place called Ingonish Beach, which is about as far away as you can get from anywhere. And as soon as I got there, I was told, because of budget cuts, you're our summer replacement. Because tourism, every year the population would more or less double because of tourists. And they said, we're not getting a summer replacement this year. You're it. So they took me out, showed me how to use the shotgun, and a bunch of. I said, what? I spent 3 days learning how to take notes and polish my shoes. Wait a second. This is. But so anyway, I spent 4.5, 5 months working with them, and then another 8 months going back to testify in various criminal trials. But the one thing you learn when you do that kind of stuff is that the way people see things, the way people observe things, and especially the way people remember things, it's not like a computer. And it's also not like a movie camera where, if you're filming something, what you're pointing at, you're going to see what you're pointing at. So eyewitness testimony, which is what a lot of UFO cases rely upon, when the skeptics tell you that it really is the least reliable form of evidence that you can find, they're right. It is. It's not to say that it's worthless, because it isn't. But it's if all you have is eyewitness testimony, one eyewitness, you can immediately discount that case. I'm not saying that whatever that eyewitness saw wasn't space aliens from outer space or something, but it's just not worth looking into because it's inherently flawed. If you have multiple, now what made the Yukon case a little more interesting is you had multiple eyewitnesses independently of each other seeing roughly the same thing in different places at different times. So, okay, that's a little better. But then you get into how the person who's interviewing them, sometimes, in fact, a lot of times, it's why they teach things like oral research methodology in master's programs in college for historians. There is a way to ask questions that does not contaminate the interview. Journalists know that, historians know that, lawyers know that. So do a few other people, police officers and so forth. UFO researchers generally don't know that. There are 1 or 2 exceptions that I've met, but the vast majority of them are not trained in how to conduct an interview. So Martin Jasek, the researcher who did the UFO case, I don't know whether he did or not, but if you're not trained in conducting interviews with witnesses, then I'm always very skeptical about what those witnesses say in terms of their description of the events. So the Yukon case, yes, did people say that there was a giant 1 mile long wide thing? I honestly don't know. That's what the reports that came out of some of the UFO researchers said, but there's no evidence other than those claims to back up that they saw, a structured craft. So, I just kind of shrug my shoulders at something like that and say, well, okay, is there another plausible explanation? And again, sorry, folks, if you want to find it, you'll have to look it up. But there was an explanation. I think it was a crashing satellite. I believe that's what it was. And I'd have to look it up to find out. That made sense because it fit with the time frame that things were happening in the Yukon at that particular time. So there you go. That would be my not terribly convincing, it's not my explanation, but that's my feeling on the Yukon case, that I sort of believe that it's, and I wrote about this a while ago, it's either been solved or at least it's not a case that I would put a whole lot of confidence in anymore because there's conflicting data, if you will. Okay. Now, the Shag Harbor case is different.
Yeah, well, I want to talk about that, but before we go into that, I just want to ask you about the documentary you did that was called Best Evidence Top 10 UFO Sightings. Yep. Do you agree with those sightings? And I believe was Shag Harbor in that? I can't remember.
It was. Shag was number 6.
Okay.
Yes.
Do you agree with what the researchers at the time came up with at that time, that those were the top 10?
I agreed with some of them. I did my own list. I actually voted myself. So I was one of the 40 or so researchers who selected the cases. I didn't treat mine any differently than anyone else's. There were cases there on that top 10 list. There are cases that I thought at the time were good cases. Some of them now I don't think are good cases. I'll give you a good example. The case that finished number 1, the RB-47 case from 1957, which is not as well known as it should be, but, at the time, almost everybody said that's a top 10 case, myself included, because you had you had very good witnesses, top-notch American pilots, you had some radar data, you had a bunch of things going on. It's a lot of moving parts. Tim Printy, who runs a magazine. So anyway, years later, I'm having this conversation with a guy named Tim Printy, who's a skeptic, runs a very good magazine called Sunlight, Sunlite, which you can look up on the internet. And there's no question, Tim's a skeptic. You could call him a debunker even. And I challenged him. I said, look, Tim, you write pretty much every episode, filmmaker or television guy, every issue you write ad nauseum about Roswell. I'm sick of it. I don't want to hear it anymore. How about, instead of bashing Roswell, which I do believe I told him is like shooting fish in a barrel, why don't you take one of the other, like a really good UFO case that hasn't been explained, and dig into it in the same way that you obsess about Roswell? And I was kind of kidding. But then I said, try the RB-47 case. It's number 1 on this film that I did. Good luck with that, I think I said. Haha, you'll never figure it out. Well, it turns out he devoted an entire issue of his magazine to his investigation into the RB-47 case. You know what? When people say that skeptics don't want to address the evidence, that they don't want to look into things, that's not true. They do. It's just they don't want to keep having, like I solved this one, so here's another one. And then I solved that one, and then here's another one, because they know it's a never-ending story. So Tim, I probably should have given him the 50th case because then but I gave him number 1 and he went straight to number 1 and he said, well, okay, here's an exhaustive analysis of it and here's what I think it was. And, I kind of read it and I said, this doesn't make any sense. You don't know what you're doing, Tim. And then I reconsidered and I went, well, actually, this does kind of make some sense. I'm not sure you're right, but I admire the fact that you actually took this on, because you've done more research into this case than most UFO researchers I know, and certainly most skeptics that I know. So good on you for taking a look at this. And so what he did is, if nothing else, in my mind, he created what we lawyers would call reasonable doubt about the case. So it would not be number 1 on my list anymore just because I have some doubts about it. But the Tehran case in Iran in 1976 was number 3, I think. That's a case that I still rate highly as an unknown. Shag Harbor is a case that I rate very highly as an unknown for a lot of different reasons, some of them personal that I can get into a little later. And I'm trying to think of the other cases that are on the list.
Well, one of them was I've had a number of conversations with Alan Bean, and he was in the Space Lab in 1971, 72. I know that's on the list.
The Skylab 3 case.
Skylab 3, that's right. That's what it was.
In the early 70s, 72 or 73, I think. They took photos of Owen Garriott. Was one of the astronauts. He was a scientist who was an astronaut, and he took photos, I think 4 photos, which NASA was kind enough to send me, of something, some strange looking thing out there in space. Bright red orangish kind of potentially object. So the UFO, it wasn't a unanimous thing by any means, because it was like number 9, I think. So it was low on the list, but enough researchers. Brad Sparks, for instance, was a researcher that highly rated the case. So that one wound up. I know Stan sort of likes that case. That one wound up on the list. And I mean, that sits in my gray basket, as Stan would say, because you have the astronauts themselves saying, yeah, that's interesting. But there's an awful lot of space junk flying around out there, too. And we've seen an awful lot of cases where people go, oh, my goodness, those are space aliens. That's a flying saucer. That's a UFO. And it turns out to be space junk, basically. And once you learn enough about photography or film or how cameras work and how that kind of stuff works, you realize that all sorts of things can be mistaken for actual objects. So that sits in my, most of the cases in my top 10 film either would sit in my gray basket, which is why they're interesting, or I think have actually probably been explained and resolved. There's no one case in that film that I would consider to be definitive proof that UFOs are extraterrestrial spacecraft, which is, the answer that everybody wants. On the other hand, there are cases in there that other people would look at and say, that's absolute proof, and good for them. It just isn't to me. I sort of have a higher standard. My standard is Carl Sagan's standard. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. And there is no more extraordinary claim that I know of, other than Jesus returning to walk amongst us. That would be pretty extraordinary. And I'd want extraordinary proof for that, too. I'm the doubting Thomas. But,
actually, I'm going to debunk that Carl Sagan, it wasn't his saying. He stole it from someone else.
Well, that's entirely possible. I know it is a Carl Sagan saying.
He did say that a lot, yes.
So whoever he stole it from, I'll go back to the original source. There you go. That's my entire point about witness testimony, that it's inherently unreliable. Story. It's like the old shampoo commercial. You tell 2 friends and you tell 2 friends. By the time you tell 50 friends, the message, the game you used to play as a kid, the message changes throughout that, which is why things like the Aztec UFO story or the Roswell story that happened 60 plus years ago, the witness testimony on that is fuzzy at best, let's say.
Yeah, I understand, and I do want to talk about that because we did have a question up on the message board earlier. But the one thing, I was speaking with Klaus Svahn over in Sweden. He used to be head of the UFO Sweden over there. And he and his wife had a sighting, and they were driving in the car, and they looked at the sighting, they were watching it, and she started to talk. He says, nope, don't say a thing. They went straight to their house. He told her to go in one room and write everything she saw and draw and everything like that. And he went into another room and he wrote everything he saw and drew, a picture. And so I think that makes a lot of sense to document right away what you think you saw and then compare notes if there's another witness.
It does in one sense, and the first thing they would teach you as a police officer after they taught me how to use the shotgun was, that was scary. Canadians, we're not used to guns. The first thing they would teach you to do is, as soon as you're finished with an incident, like we would carry notepads with us. Even as we would be talking to people, we would be writing notes. And when you would get on a witness stand months later, your memory would have changed. I remember one case where we pulled somebody over. It was a sort of speeding case. Turns out, there were drugs involved that we found in a bunch. It became much more serious. But I couldn't remember for the life of me, when I was on the witness stand, the color of the car. For some reason, I thought it was purple. I don't know. And before I could say anything, I sort of I think it was purple. Wait, hold. And it's not a relevant detail, but if you screw that one up, then they pounce on you and say, well, everything else that you remember probably a little fuzzy. So I turned to the judge and I said, look, Your Honor, the phrase we all use, could I refresh my memory by referring to my notes? The judge would say, were they made contemporaneously with the events? And I would go, yes, I made them at that time. Very well, officer, go ahead. And I'd pull them out and I'd go, oh, I'm sorry, it was orange. Purple and orange. Only in Northern Cape Breton would you get cars that were purple and orange. It was like the Duke boys. But, I said, I'm sorry, I was thinking of another car, Your Honor. It was an orange car. I remember that now. And then, because it was an irrelevant detail, moving on. But yeah, if you make those kinds of things, that's a good thing. You're still left with the question, though, that I'm sure the the judge could have asked, thought of me, is he actually telling the truth, though? Police officers do on occasion lie. People do on occasion lie. It's one of the reasons why human testimony, even if all of the protocols are followed, so even if you write things down contemporaneously, you have one or two other witnesses who are there with you, and they see the same thing and all that sort of stuff. At the end of the day, you're still human beings, and none of the rest of us were there. So it comes down to the question of, well, would you take your entire life's fortune and the life of your wife and kids or whatever, and bet those things that these people are telling the truth? And if you're willing to do that, well, then great. Good for you. But I would not be. I would never bet, not that I have a wife and kids, but if I did, they would be relieved to know I would never bet their lives on the testimony of people that I didn't know. And frankly, probably wouldn't even bet their lives on the testimony of some of the people I do know. Because, for varying reasons, people do make stuff up. So I'm not saying these folks from Sweden did. They're probably the salt of the earth. But that's just one of the problems that comes with eyewitness testimony. And that's that's the major reason why mainstream media and science and mainstream everything don't buy into the idea that UFOs are space aliens from outer space. Because they will always say, show us a piece of the crashed spacecraft, or let us meet Bob from Zeta Reticuli. And you know what? I think those are perfectly reasonable standards that you should set. That if there are space aliens coming here, show me Bob, the space alien from Zeta Reticuli. I'd like to meet him. And, I think that's a reasonable, especially in an era where we demand more, say, in our criminal trials. We demand now DNA evidence. The idea of convicting people based solely on witness testimony is becoming archaic because we realize how many people were wrongly convicted based on what we thought were good, law-abiding, upstanding citizens lying about them for whatever reason. So now we require, generally, sort of higher standards of evidence. Well, I think if we can do that in criminal trials, which is a standard that usually people like Stan trot out when they're trying to say, well, there are different types of evidence and proof and all that sort of stuff, then I think we should probably try and employ the highest possible standards before we make a positive assertion that it's absolutely true that X is happening, and in this case, X being extraterrestrials from outer space. Now, having said all that, which probably disappoints a lot of your listeners, I will say this. For you skeptics and debunkers out there, and actually I consider myself a skeptic, I would also say you can't prove a negative to begin with, but there are weird cases that cannot or have not been explained. I can talk about some of those, and those cases you cannot just dismiss them. So while I don't think that you can say that they're space aliens or anything particular, and they may well all be explainable, I think it's reasonable to sort of keep an open mind and not laugh at people and not sort of poo-poo it, and instead say, look, this is worth looking into. It might not be as worth looking into as a cure for cancer or whatever, but it is worth taking seriously. And, that's the thing that I've noticed over the 15 years that I've been looking into the UFO subculture, both sides of it, is that neither side, there's very few moderates. Canadians, we're all moderates. We're all centrists up here. Everybody's on one side or the other. There are very few people that sort of sit in that center and say, well, okay, I don't think you've proved your case, but I don't think you've disproved their case, and I think this is still worth looking at. And I think that's a reasonable, skeptical position to hold, but open-minded skepticism. So that's sort of where I come from, I guess.
I understand. One of the things I often have said, or said a number of times, is we explore as far as we have the technology to explore. If we had the capability to do interstellar travel, and we saw signs of life out on a planet that we could actually reach and explore, but not mess with the beings, whatever they are, if they're intelligent beings or not, we would do that. So are you saying, or is your thoughts along the line that you don't think that it's possible we're being visited?
Anything's possible. And I see in the chat room, Phil writes, I would like to know why he thinks it would be extraordinary for there to be visitors from off the Earth. Does he think we Earthlings are the only life in the universe? No, I don't. And I will, the universe is a massive place that we cannot possibly comprehend the size of. So let's forget about talking about the universe. Let's talk about the galaxy. Oh, wait, the galaxy is a massive space that we cannot possibly comprehend the size of. Even if we see it on a map, it's not like going to Australia. So let's talk about our own galactic neighborhood, which is still a massive space, but we can maybe begin to comprehend the size of that. There are planets that we are discovering within our own sort of galactic neighborhood that may, and you underline may 50 times, have the ability to hold life. It's possible. Is there other life? I have never met any scientist, I really haven't, who says that there is no life in this galaxy besides ours with a certainty. I've met a lot of scientists who say, we don't know, but we think there's probably life out there. It would be very unlikely that there isn't. It's a large galaxy. So there's probably other life out there somewhere. So to answer Phil's question, no, I don't think that there's no other life out there. I think that's a double negative, but I think you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. The big question is it coming here? And that's where I think it is much more unlikely that it's coming here for a whole host of reasons. Not impossible. I certainly wouldn't rule it out. Whether it's coming here today or whether it's been here 2,000 years ago or 10 million years ago or 100
doesn't really matter,
years
actually,
ago.
Right?
No. Well, I suppose it matters to us in terms of proof. If they were here 10 million years ago, we're never going to find the proof of that. Mm-hmm. So is it possible? Yes. But then you have to sort of think, well, okay, I've talked to so many people who kind of look at space travel and they say, well, you know what, we can get to the moon. It's not that hard. It's not that much. It shouldn't be that much more difficult to get to the nearest star system. And to those people, I generally, as politely as I can say it, I would say you're nuts. You don't know what you're talking about. Space is a big, horrible, dangerous place. We cannot even get to the nearest planet yet, although I think that's probably going to happen in my lifetime. If I live if I live another 30 years, I think we'll probably see people on Mars. Mm-hmm. We can get robots there. We can get probes to the edge of our solar system and beyond now. But we have no idea of how to travel to other star systems in a practical way. And we're not even close. I mean, to say we're not even close to being able to do that, we don't even know if it's actually possible. So, is there an advanced alien race? One of two things would happen. Are we literally one day away from making that discovery? Maybe we don't know today, but some super genius discovers it tomorrow, maybe. Or are we thousands of years away from it, but maybe there's a civilization out there that is thousands of years ahead of us? Well, that's possible too. So maybe they've discovered it. Fine. Maybe they've discovered it and they've chosen to come here. Fine. Again, I want to see, but that to me is an extraordinary claim that they're like a series of extraordinary claims, none of which you can prove. Do I think there's life out there? Yes. Can I prove it? No. Do I think that it's possible to travel from one star system to another? Theoretically, I'll grant you that maybe it's possible. Can I prove that it's been done? No. Can we do it? No. So, you start building a chain of improbabilities, if not impossibilities, and each one of those links in that chain makes it that much more unlikely that it's happening. Not impossible, but unlikely. So you reach a place where I really do believe you're making a truly extraordinary claim when you say space aliens are here. And at that point, you need to provide, absolutely concrete, firm evidence. And the only firm evidence I can think of would be there's the spaceship or there's the space alien. I might be able to think of one or two other pieces of evidence. A communication. What would be nice? I don't know why we feel like they have to come here. Part of me thinks it's because we want to feel important when the truth is we're, relatively speaking, a backwater in the corner of the galaxy. We're not the center of the universe that Star Trek would like us to believe we are. So I think it's much more likely, actually, working on that scale of unlikely to completely unlikely, that if there is an advanced civilization out there, SETI has the right idea. They're going about it the wrong way, but they have the right general idea that we would be contacted from away, if you will. It's a Canadian saying, if you're not from here, you're from away. So we will be contacted from away in the same way that I'm contacting you now. I've never met Martin Willis, and You've never met Paul Kimball. How do we know the two of us exist? Well, here we are. We're talking via some crazy technology that 100 years ago nobody could have imagined. That's cool. So I think that's the more likely way that we will discover that there is intelligent life out there. And frankly, we might discover that it's not as advanced as we are. Someday we might be able to pick up signs of life that is not as advanced as we are. That's possible. I don't think any of that is going to happen in my lifetime. Mars, yes, we'll get to Mars. It'd be nice if we got to Mars and we found some evidence that aliens had been on Mars before. It'd be nice if we could find some evidence that they'd been here on Earth. I just haven't seen it yet. And I will be the first one to applaud when I do, because I think that would be really, really cool. It doesn't frighten me in the least. It'd be fantastic.
All right. So of the one of the questions I want to ask you is, what would you think these things are that are extraordinary? Like, so many people are reporting. Let's just do it for instance.
Sure.
A number of people are reporting they're seeing black triangles 300 yards, a mile across, no sound at all, and that is going right over them. Reports go way back. Actually, there's a listener in Australia that was a little kid, and a triangle went over them, and the pressure sort of forced them to the ground, her and her mother. What would you say to those could possibly be? What are your thoughts about those?
Well, again, you're assuming that the witness is accurately describing something that they honestly saw. In the case I discount, and again, this will probably make me seem like an evil debunker, children's testimony I discount. It's not to say that they're not being truthful or they're not recollecting accurately, but history has shown us repeatedly that children make lousy witnesses for everything, generally speaking. And I'll just say three words to you: Salem witch trials. I mean, I'm going way back for that one, but that is a perfect example of why children are not reliable witnesses as a general rule. And I could come up with much more modern examples, most of which generally relate to child abuse cases where the narrative has not been, it's been made up. So very dangerous to rely on young witnesses, I only mention that because you mentioned the kid in Australia. But there are lots of witnesses, people who claim these things that are not young, that are adults. So fine. What do I think they are? Well, if I was to assume that they are reporting accurately what they are seeing in the sky, and they did actually see those things in the sky, I don't know. I'd have to take a look at each individual report. And it's my first instinct, though, would be to say that there's something from here, terrestrial aircraft, military in nature, almost certainly. And I think we can see throughout the history of the UFO phenomenon that a lot of what people have reported has later been shown to be some form of military aircraft, whether secret or not at that time. I'll give you two examples. Well, I'll give you one example, and then I'll give you something a friend of mine told me, which relates to this. When I was researching the best evidence film, I interviewed a guy named Lieutenant Colonel, or as you Americans would say, Lieutenant Colonel, Bruce Bailey, who actually flew RB-47s. He didn't fly the one that had the famous UFO case in 1957, but he was in an RB-47 that had a UFO encounter around Cuba a few years later during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So when I was interviewing Bailey, he said, these kinds of things were reported all the time. Okay, that's cool. You're a top-notch, highly decorated. He wasn't a pilot; he was a radar operator, but still, on one of the most secret planes in the United States. And I said, well, what do you think about the idea that they would have been one of ours? And he said, well, we sort of knew because they were flying the most advanced, secretive plane, except for the U-2, out there. They sort of knew what was in the sky because everything. They were at the top of the secrecy food chain, except for the U-2. But he recounted cases where fighter jets were actually scrambled. American jets were scrambled to intercept things that were classified or would be classified as UFOs, in that they didn't know what they were. There were these objects coming in the sky over your airspace, the American airspace, that could pose a threat. So naturally you scramble jets. What it turned out those things were, as Colonel Bailey explained it to me, us. And he meant him. And he said, we always knew that coming back, because our missions were so secret, the fighter command pilots were not briefed that we were going to be coming in. And he said that always created the risk of them shooting us down. And I thought, well, that sounds crazy. And he said, well, if you think that's crazy, imagine how U-2 pilots felt, because they were the apex predators of secrecy. And so, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. There are things flying around in the sky, and there always have been, that even most of the military are not aware of, including fighter command and, the sort of people charged with protecting us. And so that brings me to Carl Flock, the late Carl Flock, who some of your listeners might know because he was a UFO researcher and a good friend of mine, passed away several years ago of Lou Gehrig's disease. And Carl, I was talking to Carl once because besides being in his previous life before he was a UFO researcher, Carl was with the CIA, but he was also an assistant secretary of defense for weapons procurement. I believe that was his exact title in the Reagan administration. So he had, a pretty good understanding of secrecy, a pretty good understanding of how government worked. And in particular, he had a good understanding of how the defense establishment worked. And I'll paraphrase, what Carl told me in a very long-winded way. But he said, whatever the government is telling you they have today, whatever they admit to having, is 10 to 15 years behind what they actually have.
Yeah, I've heard that a number of times.
And I've heard that from other people since then, because if I run into somebody who's worked for one of the lettered agencies or is formerly in the defense establishment, and I have over the years, I'll ask them, was Carl sort of telling me the truth? And they will all say, yeah, generally speaking. And a lot of it is guesswork on our part because we weren't in the know. But yeah, there was stuff going on that was beyond what we were doing. And so when you look up and you say, well, okay, those aircraft are moving in ways that we can't do. Well, we can't do it now, according to what we think we know. But maybe if we're using technology that is 10, 15, 20 years, secret technology that nobody's telling us about, because as Stan is always saying, you don't want your enemies to know what you know. So maybe we have technology, and I think it is extremely likely that we have technology that is well in advance of what they will actually admit to having. Is there a secret militarized space program? Of that, I have absolutely no doubt. And is the technology that they are using more advanced than what we see with civilian launches in the old shuttle program? Again, of that, I have virtually no doubt, because that's how government works. And unfortunately, that's how the American government in particular works. And anyone who's familiar with the Edward Snowden disclosures or the Chelsea Manning disclosures or the Pentagon Papers, or you can go back throughout American history of the last 60 years, you can see that things are kept secret. And the same thing is true in Canada, in the United Kingdom, in France, in China, in Russia. All countries keep secrets, even from their allies, even from people within their own sort of higher echelons of the defense establishment. So when you see triangle cases, for instance, that were reported over Belgium in the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, I don't think it's any coincidence that shortly thereafter, we start to see triangle-shaped aircraft in the United States Air Force.
Well, that's it for the first part of the show. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to hear the whole show, it gets pretty interesting. Plus, all the shows in our archives, full shows that is, all you have to do is support us for $2 or more per month. All that information's on podcastufo.com. The show does have a lot of expenses, and going out to Phoenix, just adding more expenses. Also, if you don't want to have a monthly subscription, you can also sign up for a yearly subscription for as little as $25 per year. Anyway, our guest next week is Connie Willis. There's no relation to myself. She's been on Coast to Coast and very interesting guest. Well, thank you all, and we'll be back same time live next week. Remember, you can always listen to the full show live and join in the chat room at podcastufo.com on Wednesdays at 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thanks a lot. Catch you next week. Keep your eyes to the sky and your curiosity high.